Everybody, welcome back to Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is going to be quite a bit of review from your freshman biology class, but it does need a good refresher, so I would definitely read it through, pay close attention to some of the information that I'm highlighting as well. We're going to start with species versus population. A species is organisms that are able to mate and create viable offspring with each other. So a population would then be that group of species and the location that they live in. So bunnies are the species. The particular population would be the bunnies located only in Vernon Hills. Think back to natural selection and how we refer to it mainly as survival of the fittest, where good traits are going to allow somebody to survive, the bad traits won't. Sometimes we call that selected for. If you're selected for, you have good traits and you will survive. If you're selected against, you have bad traits and you're not going to live. We call those good traits adaptations. Adaptations are the favorable traits for that environment. So your ability to blend in the rainforest, the adaptation that we'd be looking for would be green skin. Remember, adaptation isn't a verb. You don't adapt. You can't choose to be taller. You either are given the trait from the beginning in your DNA sequencing or you don't. Mutations do drive this. Mutations, if you remember, right down here, they're not always good, they're not always bad, but certain mutations actually lead to adaptations that allow you to survive better in your environment. Sometimes environmental changes, which can happen gradually or suddenly, like a volcanic eruption versus a gradual progression, they are going to threaten species survival. If the individual species has the adaptation that's favorable for change, they're going to survive and pass those genes on to the next generation, which leads to change in the genetic level and then over time, evolution of that species. These images right here talk about the different types of selection, so make sure you take a look at that and refresh your memory on those different types. Another big topic, since we have natural selection happening naturally based off of the environment, we have artificial selection, which is any type of selection that's going to be controlled by humans. We decide what traits we want to see and what traits we want to see passed on to the next generation. And therefore, we actually start to change the gene pool and adjust it. We do this with dog breeds. We want this particular dog mixed with this particular breed. We've done it with food over time, with like corn and cabbage in this case, broccoli as well. So we've actually bred things to change in the manner in which we want them to. Biodiversity is something that you need to make sure you understand why it's so important to have variety in life. And this just comes about if everybody was exactly the same and one event occurred, pretty much everybody would get wiped out. So having changes and differences in genetics allows certain species to live when others might not, like the dinosaurs. Okay, if you remember your freshman year talking about the rock pocket mice populations or the squirrels of the Grand Canyon, that was called speciation. So taking a look at this lovely picture, speciation occurs when there's usually a physical separation between two groups. So in this case, you can have glaciers, rivers, mountains, and this one has lava that separate the population. And because of that barrier, the population doesn't breed with each other anymore. So these flies are at a great enough distance that they can't travel from island to island. And so this group starts to reproduce only amongst themselves, while this group does the same. Over time, what we see is that certain genes are more prevalent in each population. So if you look here, this species actually is mainly yellow. This one's mainly red. If we were to unite these two fly populations then back together, what we would find is that they're actually their own species. They won't breed with each other. During that time of separation, their gene pools were completely different. They start to establish their own mating rituals, their own language, their color. They have their own habitats that they might live in and food sources that they eat. It's very similar to the birds in your backyard. They exist in the same location together, they don't breed with each other. They have different languages, different cares now. We're going to skip ahead a few more pages to the word endemic. Endemic are species that are only found in one location on Earth. And this is important to understand because it can lead a lot to extinction. If you're only found in one place, your resources are only found in that one location. If those resources are threatened, that population won't survive anymore. So going into extinctions, a lot of animals that we see in the fossil record are actually extinct nowadays. And this is due to several mass extinctions that we've had on Earth. We've had 5 so far, with the most famous one, the KT mass extinction. That's the one that took the dinosaurs. We're currently actually in a 6th mass extinction that's man-made due to our overhunting, habitat destruction, introducing invasive species, pollution of the air, water, and soil. So we're actually causing the 6th mass extinction currently. We need to make sure that you understand the definitions of ecology, and within that, biotic and abiotic. So, and the levels of organization, which we'll see on the next page. But remember the differences between abiotic and biotic. The abiotic is anything that's not alive in your ecosystem. That's the water, the wind, the air. The biotic are the living things, the plants, the animals, all that stuff. So communities, if we pop over here to your levels of organization, you remember these? Biosphere being the biggest, down to organism, which is the smallest. So we've already talked about a single organism of a species, populations. Communities are all the living things that are found in that particular location. All the bunnies, the birds, the grass, the trees, and that in one area. Then we pop up to the ecosystem. Ecosystem includes the living and non-living items within that location. So that would be now your bunnies, your grass, your trees, the clouds, the water, the rocks, and everything else in that particular location. So take a look at those, review those materials again. Okay. Don't forget habitat, again, living and non-living things that provide organisms' needs. That's your habitat. Your niche is the role that you play within that community. And the niche could either be one of 2 things. You could be a specialist or a generalist. So if you think about the niche like a lion, lions are the top predators. A bunny's niche is to provide food sources for the lions and be an herbivore. Generalists, these guys can live in many different places, like a coyote. They have a wide range and a wide tolerance and pretty much can survive in a lot of environments. A specialist can only live in a few particular areas. So mountain lions are kind of like this. They actually have a tendency of becoming endangered or extinct more easily because, again, if those resources go away in that more specialized environment, they're actually going to be strained. So general species actually have an advantage versus the specialist species. There's also something called an indicator species. These are plants or animals that we search for in a particular environment, and if we see them there, we know that the environment is actually doing really well. Frogs have a tendency of being like this. They breathe through their skin, so if the frog population decreases in an aquatic environment, we know that the water is probably, or the air as well, is probably polluted. So we look at these indicator species, and if they're present, we know that the ecosystem's doing well. Remember these from your freshman year. Make sure to go over the different types of distributions that we have, again, of populations. So when they're, more spread out versus clumped versus uniform, take a look at those. And we're going to skip ahead to exponential growth. So exponential versus logistic growth. Exponential growth is unlimited growth due to unlimited resources, food, water, Basically, the population keeps multiplying and produces this J curve. That's not realistic because eventually there's going to be some sort of limiting factor. So most populations do reach a logistic growth curve, and it's limited again by the resources. And we call that carrying capacity. So we take a look at that. Here is your logistic growth. We call it the S curve. And again, the population starts to grow more exponentially. And eventually the resources start to dwindle. And we see this cap off of the amount of a population an environment can actually sustain. And we call that the carrying capacity. So at some point we reach that maximum amount. And this can actually fluctuate depending on the year. If you have a drought one year or a natural disaster, maybe with that environment can't hold enough resources to sustain a large population. So the carrying capacity might be smaller that year versus years where there's better growth. So there are times that we have this limiting factors, and those limiting factors are stuff like resources, maybe the temperature, the amount of predators in the environment, or diseases that might be occurring. If you overshoot your carrying capacity, you actually can lead to famine, disease, or conflict, and the population will start to die off. And that could lead to resource depletion. Of those lovely limiting factors, though, there are two types. There's density dependent and density independent. So the independent are those that we can't control. Storms, fires, heat, and droughts. Those are the things that could affect how much an environment can hold of a population. Density dependent are stuff like clean water, air, food, and disease. We actually do have some control over if there's enough water, if there's enough clean air around. So there's a little bit more control with those density dependent factors. And this goes into survivorship curves. So survivorship curves show the relative survival rate of somebody in a population. There are actually three types. They're highlighted here by definition and here in the lovely little graph. So if you are a type 1 organism, your survival, you're going to live young and you're going to die at old age. So you're going to survive a long, long life. These are things like humans, apes, whales, top predators, and large mammals. Type 2 organisms, these guys, they have an equal death rate whether they're young or old. And this is stuff like birds. Some birds are dying young, some birds are dying old. There's really no longevity that's specific to one side or the other. Type 3, that's these guys here. They have a high death rate at young ages, but after they've survived long enough through childhood, they actually can live out a pretty long life. These are your prey animals or trees. If the seed actually can bloom and they can make it past those little tiny years, they're probably going to live to be a huge long tree later on in life. So plants, trees, sea turtles are like this. They can make it off the beach. They're probably going to live hundreds of years. So we're going to come over to biotic potential now. Biotic meaning living, so life potential. It's basically the population's maximum reproductive rate in an ideal condition. How much are you able to actually reproduce if everything is going well for your population? So as we talk about reproduction, we're going to look at the different types of species and how they would reproduce. K-selected species, these guys up here, they're usually larger. They don't have as many offspring. They live in a more stable environment. They care for their children. They don't just give birth to the kids and let them go. They have a longer lifespan. They reproduce maybe not once within their life, but a couple of times. And they typically have that type 1 survivorship curve where they live really, really long late in age. These are your bigger animals and mammals. Think about it, like deer. They take care of their young. Whales take care of their young. They don't just let them go. Humans, same way. Your parents care for you, make sure you're established before you're released. Our selected species are small. They have a lot of offspring. They don't invest a lot of time in their children. They really reach maturity quickly, so they're able to reproduce after a short period of time. So think about flies. They have a short lifespan, typically prey species, high biotic potential, so they can make a lot of children at one time, and they are type 3 in their survivorship curve. And the natural selection tends to favor them because they can reproduce so quickly. So that's typically like your bugs and your nasty stuff like that. So we're going to come back to this unit in chapter